Hi, Frank.
Hey, Bob.
How you doing?
Pretty swell.
Swell?
Yeah.
No, just pretty swell.
Groovy.
Okay.
Downright groovy.
Okay. Well, congratulations on that.
Thank
And
you.
this is a good transition. Congratulations on this book. Let me introduce you before continuing. First of all, I'm Robert Wright of Blogging Heads TV and The Wright Show, which this is. You are Franklin Foer, the editor of the New Republic, the author of this soccer book, How Soccer Explains Everything or something?
The World.
The World, okay. And, most importantly, co-editor of and a contributor to, one of many esteemed contributors to, the brand new volume, Jewish Jocks and Unorthodox Hall of Fame. Now, unorthodox is possibly a pun, but if we stick with its literal meaning,
Yes.
how would you say it illuminates this book and its mission?
Right. So, if we were to stick to an orthodox canon of Jewish jocks, we'd be limited to your Sandy Koufaxes, your Mark Spitz, your Hank Greenbergs, some boxers from the early 20th century, and a few others. But if we take a more expansive, a more creative reinterpretation of what it means to be a Jewish athlete, it allows us to include the likes of Steven Pinker. Sorry, not Steven Pinker. Howard Cosell.
Steven Pinker is a
not-
contributor, and we do not doubt his athletic prowess.
You
I
should
want
see
to
him.
go on the record.
When he posts up on me and dunks on me,
Yeah.
it's a sight to behold.
They've always said that
Evolutionary
about
biology in motion.
Yeah, it's the primate in him. Yeah, so this would be a good example on the back of the. This
That's
is Howard
Howard
Cosell.
Cosell.
So far as I know, he did not wind up holding any records in the NFL per se. So he must be an example of one of these non-jock jocks.
It's a great example of a non-jock jock. David Remnick wrote the essay about Howard Cosell. Another great example of a non-jock jock is Red Auerbach, who Steven Pinker, the slam dunk king of Cambridge, Massachusetts, wrote about.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have various other owners, broadcasters, and part of the whole point of the book is that if on the surface you would say that the Jewish contribution to sports is not exactly monumental. But when you go beyond the actual players on the field and you start to look at the whole picture, you see that the Jewish contribution to sports has actually been quite sizable. The NFL, I think, is a great example of this because I don't know if you think of pro football as a very Jewish sport. Certainly my mother didn't, which is probably part of the reason why. Actually, my mother didn't think very many sports were Jewish sports, which explains probably a lot about my physical proclivities. But football was a game where the position of the modern quarterback was actually invented by two Jewish quarterbacks. You had a guy called Benny Friedman, who started at the University of Michigan, and then Sid Luckman, who played at Columbia, and also with the Chicago Bears, where he invented the T formation. And then you had the great Sid Gilman, who was one of the masterminds of the modern offense. And so he took the offenses that these modern quarterbacks developed and then built them out into whole superstructures. And you got guys like Al Davis, who then in turn reinvented the very definition of the modern pro football franchise. And so you don't want to, it would be silly to overstate the case here, but the impact of the individuals that I just described is negligible. They helped make the modern game. And then if you go even further out into the realm of the way in which the game's experienced, and you look at like Steve Sable, who invented NFL Films, which is so instrumental to the whole mythology of the game. Or
is he the one who just died? There was an obit.
Yeah, exactly. Or fantasy sports, which is the ways in which so many folks interact with the games, which was invented by Daniel Okren. And so there's a great essay by Jonathan Muller in the book, which argues that in effect all sports fans are Jewish nerds now because they interact with the game through this fantasy rotisserie leagues, which are kind of a quintessentially Jewish male way to interact with those games.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so all dimensions of sports, just about. It sounds like.
And for me, some of my favorite essays in the books are the ones that are maybe not what you'd expect. So the greatest Jewish bullfighter who ever lived, who also happens to be the greatest Jewish gay bullfighter who ever lived, was a guy called was Sidney Franklin was his stage name, and he was born Sidney Fremkin, and he comes from, of all places, Brooklyn. But he had a big fight with his father when he was 19 years old, and he moved down to Mexico. And he was in the schmata business or something down in Mexico, and he was sitting at a bar one night, and some guy says to him, "Hey, Sidney, Americans can't bullfight for a pile of caca." And so the guy says, "You're wrong." And he goes out and he learns how to bullfight. And it turns out Sidney Franklin from Brooklyn is actually a pretty decent bullfighter, and he does really well in Mexico. And so he goes, "Hey, I've done great in Mexico. I'm going to the big stage, which is Spain." And so he goes to Seville, and his first bullfight, he's magnificent. And he becomes this national hero, this oddity who actually happens to be good in Spain. And we're talking about bullfighting in the 1930s. 1920s and 30s, which means we're talking about Ernest Hemingway. And so, of course, Hemingway ends up becoming a great promoter of this guy, Sidney Franklin, and helps create some of the mythology surrounding him. And after Sidney Franklin gets gored a couple times and he doesn't have the innards, his innards aren't put together in the right way, he has to give up bullfighting, and he becomes Hemingway's eyes and ears during the Spanish Civil War. And in fact, Ernest Hemingway's wife was especially keen to have Sidney there in order to provide some sort of buffer between Hemingway and Martha Gellhorn, who she rightly suspected was having an affair with Hemingway. And Franklin gets really ticked off eventually with Hemingway because he's going out and he's doing all this reporting for him on the streets of Madrid, and Hemingway shacked up with Gellhorn. And he says, "What the hell am I doing here while, doing all this guy's work while he's busy stupping all the time?" And he gives up on Hemingway. And in fact, Lillian Ross wrote her first piece for the New Yorker about Sidney Franklin, and it's a wonderful piece in which she punctures a lot of the mythology that this guy continued to maintain about himself and his greatness, and also his sexual exploits, which he sold a little bit too hard for. Given his homosexuality, and that was it. So he has this whole literary pedigree, which I found kind of entertaining.
Now that's a much better story than the Sandy Koufax story.
Well, Sandy Koufax, you ask, how could we write about Sandy Koufax, one of the most written about athletes in the Pantheon? And this was indeed a challenge for us. We asked Jane Levy, who wrote a splendid, highly regarded biography of Sandy Koufax, to see if there was some sort of way that she could go at it again. And she wrote a delightful little essay about Sandy Koufax coming to her daughter's bat mitzvah. And she uses the whole occasion as a meditation on Sandy Koufax's temperament, which is in turn a way to get at some of the big questions about Sandy Koufax, namely, why did he quit when he was at the top of his game? It's another way of getting at this whole question of, he wasn't a terribly observant Jew. Why was it that he took off Yom Kippur when he did? And
which was a World Series game. I mean, that's when I was young and read the Sandy Koufax story or whatever. That's one of the things I remember, and that I guess got a lot of attention at the time.
Yeah, it got a lot of attention, and it continues to live, I think, in the way that, in not just the way that American Jews talk about sports, but the way that they talk about their engagement with the secular world. That here was a guy who was engaged in baseball, which was really a form of Jews stitching themselves into the American story. That it was baseball was critical to Americanization and secularization, and here was a guy who was involved in the most American, most secular of activities, and he was still able to take this stand, which was perceived as going against his self-interest. And he was able to do it in a way in which it basically earned him the respect, ultimately, of the wider world. And so it's kind of it's kind of the high moment in the whole American Jewish story of assimilation.
Well, he's also possibly the most accomplished athlete in the book. I mean, I think people forget how utterly dominant he was during his relatively brief career. One thing I learned while reading that profile of him in your book is that in his final season, 1966, he won 27 games, which, first of all, is pretty extraordinary. In the average year, no pitcher in all of baseball wins that many probably, but every one was a complete game. Now, that he pitched all 9 innings. That, I venture to say, will never, ever be done again, partly because of changes in baseball and more use of relief pitchers. But that's amazing.
No.
I wonder if anyone had ever done that before or since.
Accomplishment. I think you would have to say that maybe Mark Spitz, who's such an unappealing character, is equal to that just because his haul of Olympic medals was such that
he won 8 or something.
Yeah, and one Olympic, and then he'd done well, and he had more in '68. It was an impressive individual achievement.
And that's a great piece by Judas Shulevitz, right? In the book. Now, I have a question. Should I have known Mark Spitz was Jewish? I genuinely did not. And whereas Sandy Koufax is kind of famously Jewish, and I'm actually old enough to remember the '72 Olympics. And of course, these were the infamous Munich Olympics, so his ethnicity was relevant. But is it a super widely known fact?
Right. I think it was pretty super widely known, especially during those Olympics where his presence was really part of the way that the media wrote about those Olympics in general, because those Olympics were meant to be the occasion in which the Germans kind of rehabilitated themselves on the national stage, that here they were able to interact with all the other nations of the world in a perfectly normal sort of way. And part of the normalcy was that you had this Jewish athlete coming there, and everybody knew he was going to have a dominating performance going into the games. And then certainly after the Palestinians murdered those Jewish athletes in the Olympic Village, he was asked about it and actually whisked away from Munich, told to duck down in his car on the way to the airport because they were so concerned about his well-being.
Yeah, I guess, I was young. But I certainly remember the tragedy itself. That I remember. Still remember the ABC guy breaking the news when they found out that they were all dead.
In fact, Howard Cosell, another one of our characters in the book, he was upset. He'd been out, I think, drinking the night before, and he didn't get to, he showed up at the studios and demanded to broadcast during that day, but they told him to go home and sleep it off. And so Jim McKay did it, and that was
It's Jim McKay. I remember exactly what he said. He came out and he said, "My father used to say that our greatest hopes and our worst fears are seldom realized. Well, tonight our worst fears have been realized." We should talk about your own contribution, because I was not aware of Benny Leonard. Is that his name? But that's another case of a guy who apparently was truly a pretty dominant figure in his day.
Right. Well, I think if you grow up Jewish, even if you grow up, I think if you told anybody in the year 2010 that boxing was once a sport that was heavily dominated by Jews, I think you'd be surprised. Did you know that?
No, actually, I was surprised. I didn't know that there had been a golden era of Jewish boxing.
Right. Well, it goes. You have this period where you have this massive wave of immigration from Russia and Eastern Europe, and you had all these people coming to this land with this idea that they were going to somehow escape a lot of the physical violence that they had experienced in their own homeland. Yet they came to these neighborhoods in New York City and in various other major metropolises where you had lots of ethnic groups jammed up against one another. And so you had, just as part of the run of existence, all sorts of altercations between Jewish kids and Irish kids and Jewish kids and Italian kids. And so fighting was kind of part of their everyday experience. And then you also had the existence of the settlement house movement. And the settlement house movement was largely funded by German Jews who'd been in this country for a long period of time, and they looked down at the Lower East Side, and they said, "Look at all these dirty, physically decrepit specimens who've come to this country. Kind of embarrassing to us, and we need to spend a little bit of money helping them to become more normal Americans." And part of their definition of more normal Americans were people who knew how to do physical things, who didn't look like effeminate, bookish guys who'd never been exposed to the sunlight. And so the settlement houses became great crucibles for teaching Jews sports. You had basketball, was taught in the settlement houses, and basketball in this country grew out in large part from the settlement house movement, and boxing was the same. And so you had guys like Benny Leonard who fought with the Irish kids in his neighborhood in the Lower East Side, and who would get walloped. And his uncle said, "Hey, I'm going to take you down to the settlement house, and we're going to have the guys there teach you how to fight like a real man." And so Benny learned how to fight, and he was a significant figure for a couple of reasons. The first was that he helped create a lot of the technique of modern boxing. He was really good at feints, and he had a great deal of strategic acumen, and really was very good at diagnosing his opponent's weaknesses. And he was kind of a slippery fighter, and so he won not on the basis of his overwhelming strength, but on the basis of his trickery. And of course, the idea of a tricky Jew is one that lends itself to anti-Semitic tropes. And so you had Henry Ford weighing in about how even though Benny Leonard won all these championships, he wasn't really a real man. But the other part of the Benny Leonard mythology that's really important is that he was a big-time mama's boy. And so he helped reassure immigrant moms and dads that sport wasn't necessarily a route to organized to crime, and that there was no reason in which participation in sports would undermine the rationale for coming to this country in the first place.
Now, maybe, I guess it's probably not, I guess there have been various periods in boxing history where you could say it was dominated by relatively new immigrant groups. In fact, back then I would imagine Italians and Irish were also in the game. Now, as the sport developed, and all three of those groups saw their market share decline, it's much more, I guess, Hispanic and black now. Was there a legacy of the Jewish participation in terms of other kinds of involvement in the sport?
Yes, you had a lot of the writers, the sports writers who covered boxing, including the great Bert Sugar, who's perhaps the dean of all boxing scribes, was Jewish. Everlast, the company that supplies gloves and punching bags, was a Jewish concern. So very much so. And you had cutmen and trainers who were Jewish up through the 60s. And so you can see with World War II and the GI Bill and a lot of the social transformation that you're describing, the end of the great Jewish pugilists. But the end of the great Jewish cutmen, seconds, trainers doesn't really end until another 10 or 15 years later. And the era of the great Jewish boxing writers continues up until relatively recently.
Okay, now the thing you were just talking about, a kind of a self-conscious effort to improve the athletic profile and reputation of your ethnic group, right? Reminds me of the most offbeat essay probably in the book about Max Nordau.
Yes.
Right. Now, tell us about, that was not a name I was familiar with. Tell us about him.
So that essay is written by the historian Timothy Snyder. And Max Nordau was one of the two most important figures in the history of early Zionism, along with Theodor Herzl. And in his time, he was actually more famous than Theodor Herzl. He'd been a great journalist and playwright and aesthete in Central Europe, and had written a very important book called Degeneration. And his idea was that Europe was entering into a state of actual physical degeneracy that was reflected in a state of mental degeneracy. And his argument was that needed to be reversed. And he took that argument, which he was making about European society in a very broad sort of way, and ultimately translated it into a very Jewish context. And so he saw what was happening to Dreyfus, the famous French general who was accused of treason, and saw him railroaded. And he kind of lost faith in Europe, in this European ideal that he himself was greatly committed to. And that steered him in the direction of Theodor Herzl. And he had a slogan, or not a slogan, he had an archetype that he aspired to see created, which was one called muscular, the muscle Jews. And so the only way that Jews were going to be able to surmount the anti-Semitism that they faced was to become real physical specimens themselves. And so all across Central Europe, you had Jewish sports clubs created. And in those Jewish sports clubs, you would see pictures of this bearded old guy who was Max Nordau. And that was true also. This was transported from a Central European to an Israeli context. So if you go to Israel now, they're athletic teams that are all part of various sports movements that grew out of Zionism. There is Hapoel teams. There's like Hapoel Tel Aviv and Haifa in both soccer and basketball, and those are the labor Zionist clubs. There's Beitar, which are the revisionist Zionist clubs that hold Jabotinsky up as their great icon. And then there's the Maccabi clubs, which are the more mainstream ones that trace more directly back to Max Nordau, if that makes sense. And so he's a wonderful character whose lover was, of course, an anti-Semitic Russian aristocrat.
Naturally. And is this related to a theme that I gather had a place in early Zionism about, wasn't there kind of an agrarian, an ideal about manual labor and the idea that Israel was going to be a land where, I gather part of the idea was that stereotypes were going to be defied, right? I mean,
exactly. So part of the whole early Zionist ideal was that you were going to have Jewish bodies who were going to redeem a Jewish land through Jewish labor, which would in turn redeem Jewish bodies. So you would have these, you would send out these weak specimens who would come off the ships from Russia and Eastern Europe, and they would go to their kibbutzim, and they would harvest, they would work this kind of impossible land and make it flourish. And in the course of doing their farming, they would in turn become these tough physical specimens.
Okay. Now I have to indulge an interest of my own here in golf.
Yes.
And say that I learned in your book that Corey Pavin is in a certain sense a tragic figure, in the sense that had he waited 4 or 5 more years to convert to evangelical Christianity, then he would have, then we could say in a more thoroughgoing sense that he was a Jew who won the U.S. Open, but we have to say it in a more circumscribed sense.
He was a Jew for Jesus.
He was a Jew for Jesus. And he had been, is he the one who had participated in the Maccabean Games? He had fully claimed his Jewish heritage before having this experience. He's interesting for a number of reasons. He's not a very imposing physical specimen, was known for that. But it turns out there are a lot of evangelicals in the PGA. And I wonder whether it's, golf's a very psychological sport. Do you, like your brother, play golf or not, Frank?
I'm not.
You're not. Well, let the record show that you have a brother who plays golf.
Yes.
And it's a very psychological game.
Right.
And I can imagine that thinking that there's a very active kind of God, a very, an evangelical kind of conception of God who, if you have faith in him, is going to look after you. Maybe, I don't know, this is just maybe it's a crackpot theory, but...
I buy that. But here's another thing, which is that if you're... I guess the PGA Tour is also a very, very solitary thing, or could be a very solitary thing. If you're not able to establish a sense of camaraderie with your fellow players, it would probably stink to go from Marriott hotel to Marriott hotel, and then to sit in the locker room with guys you weren't especially friendly with. I wonder if there was that makes somebody like Corey Pavin an especially ripe target for conversion. Of course, I don't know the specifics well enough to comment on that, but it just seems you could think of a whole variety of reasons why somebody like him would be drawn to evangelicalism.
That's a good point. It is famously solitary, and that's why the Ryder Cup, which is a team event that happens every 2 years, is such a life-changing event for these guys.
Hey, Bob, do you have a theory on why there's so few Jews in the PGA Tour? Because I look at all the Jewish country clubs, and I look at all the Jewish doctors who play golf, and it just seems to me that it's crazy that not one of those doctors convinced their sons or daughters to go out and become a professional golfer, that not one of those clubs could develop a cadre of Jewish golfers. Tennis is a similarly country club type of sport, and there are plenty of Jewish professionals.
There's a profile of, what is it, Harold Solomon, profiled by Larry Summers?
Yeah.
The tennis player I actually remember watching on TV. I don't know. I mean, this sounds like a little stereotype bait you're throwing my way. I mean, it is very psychological in the sense that peace of mind is important. I mean, I'll let you take it from here and throw out any stereotypes that might not be compatible with perfect equanimity. I don't know. I mean, there is like an anxiety or neuroses stereotype. I mean, I speak from experience slightly because you don't know me that well. You probably know me well enough to know that I'm a little neurotic and anxious, and I'm a bad golfer because, that temperament is not conducive to good golf. So that's my, I guess that's the only vile stereotype I could throw out.
I wonder. I mean, I wonder if path dependence doesn't become part of it at a certain point. That if you grow up, it's probably not so true now, but certainly at earlier stages in the history of sports, that if you looked at the professional golf circuit and you didn't see any examples of people who kind of looked like you, whether you just somehow subconsciously shut it out as a potential.
That makes sense. I mean, I know that there is that effect, and they say that Tiger Woods has opened the game to a lot of young, black kids and so on. That totally is an effect. I mean, there are some very very nice Jewish country clubs. They were historically Jewish. Now they're opened, but Wright, not that far from me. But that makes sense. It certainly was originally a waspy sport, I guess, and so path dependence is as good a theory as any.
It was the one miss I had in assigning. It was actually one of the easiest assigning missions that I've ever gone on. Was I tried to get Tom Friedman to write about Corey Pavin because, Tom Friedman, he's a golfer. He's got lots of theories of things, and he's obsessed with Corey Pavin, and he seemed to have some very evolved thoughts about why it was that Jews had never excelled at golf. In fact, I think he writes an occasional column or maybe a regular column in Golf Magazine.
I think that's right.
Yeah.
I'm sure he would have a theory. If he didn't, it would be the first time he had his come up blank on the theory front.
Right. And so, you know what they say when he's in range for a putt?
When Tom Friedman is? What?
Yeah. I said when he's in range for a putt,
yeah.
It's a Friedman unit. Just a Friedman unit away from sinking that sucker.
So elsewhere, just a couple of among the unexpected entries in your book is Renee Richards. Maybe our younger viewers don't know who Renee Richards was. I don't know. But in general, when people focused on her identity issues, they did not focus on ethnicity. Let's put it that way.
Right. Well, Renee Richards, as some of your younger viewers may not know, was actually a guy named Richard. And he had various identity issues, and when he was about 40 years old, became a woman. And when he became a woman, he also became a professional woman tennis player. And so in his early 40s, he started to do fairly well at some tournaments. If she had been younger, she would have probably done much better. But her presence on the tour spurred a lot of questions that probably still haunt sports, which is who's a man, who's a woman, how artificial are these categories that we use in order to separate out participants in both sports? Why is it that we separate out male and female divisions into various sports? And she pressed those questions very, very hard, and she won an important lawsuit which established transgendered rights. But there was a great deal of hostility to her presence, and I think one of the interesting things is that it created a little bit of a culture war on the tennis tour, where you had Martina Navratilova and Billie Jean King, who were, I believe, both in the closet at that point, defending her, and then you had others like Chris Everett Lloyd, who were campaigning against her presence on the tour.
And then one thing I learned from the essay in your book is Renee Richards had a change of heart about the issue, and later said, having fought and earned acknowledgement of the right of people like her to participate in tennis, she later said it wasn't fair and they shouldn't have the right, because she said, look, I was 40 years old and I'm now paying attention to what my body does. I realize if I'd been 22 and gotten a sex change operation, I would have been head and shoulders above every female on the tour, and it wouldn't have been fair. So
right. It's Emily Bazelon, who many of your Slate viewers will recognize. Her byline wrote that entry, and she'd spoken with Renee Richards on the phone. And I think that these are issues that matter a lot to Emily and that interest her a great deal. And I think they had a very nice conversation where Renee Richards kind of came clean about some of her second thoughts.
Yeah, no, it's a very good piece. And there are a lot of good pieces. Are there any other ones before we sign off that you want to single out?
Yeah, so some of my other favorite ones. Simon Schama wrote about a guy called Daniel Mendoza, who was a bare-knuckle boxer in late 18th century London. And he was kind of the prototype of the Jewish pugilist, that he was a guy who whenever you wanted to impugn a successful Jewish athlete, you described his method as being scientific. And so he was known as a scientific fighter, meaning that there was a great deal of strategy and sometimes trickery that went into his methodology. But Daniel Mendoza was the first Jew of any sort to meet the King or Queen of England, which there's a fantastic set piece at the beginning of the Schama essay. There's Helene Mayer, who was a German Jewish woman who fenced for the Nazis in the 1936 Olympics, which is a fantastic essay by the novelist Joshua Cohen. I love Mark Leibovich's piece, which is the last piece in the book, which is about Theo Epstein, who was the general manager of the Boston Red Sox and is now the general manager of the Chicago Cubs. And Theo Epstein, of course, is known as being the guy who broke the Red Sox curse, that he used Moneyball and various other analytic devices in order to engineer a team that was able to kick off whatever superstitions were, superstitious curse was holding back the Boston Red Sox. And so Epstein is a fantastic character because his father was a novelist called Leslie Epstein, who wrote a book called The King of the Jews, a novel called The King of the Jews. His grandfather and great uncle wrote the screenplay for Casablanca. And you would think that Theo Epstein has maybe the best job in the world, that he gets to run these venerable franchises and hang out with players. But since he grew up in lefty therapeutic Brookline, Massachusetts, and he has a twin brother who's a social worker, he's filled with all sorts of guilt that he's not doing enough to improve the world. And so even though he has this beautiful job and has done great things with it, he's cursed by his anxiety.
Yeah. Okay, so, one thing I'm curious about, did this start off, was your plan originally to stick with Jocks per se?
No.
Never.
No, I mean, I'm interested in the history of sports, and so it seems it never felt like a natural thing to me to demarcate the subjects to just players. Uh-huh. I find the owners and the agents and the broadcasters almost as interesting as the players.
Yeah. Okay, well, it definitely works and gives you a full, a multi-dimensional view of the history of sports and certain aspects of, social history and history more broadly. Just quickly, not that you asked, but you know what, if you had asked me to think of some kind of offbeat kind of genre of Jewish contribution to sports,
yes,
you know what it would have been? When I was a kid, I read all of these sports biographies.
Yes.
And now at the time, I wouldn't have known a Jewish name if I had met one on the street. I just wasn't conscious of it. I maybe because I wasn't on the East Coast or whatever, but it wasn't an issue. But I did remember the names of the two writers that I read book after book after book from. And one was Milton J. Shapiro, who I guess we can presume was Jewish. And I later, compared notes with actually a guy who's a sports writer. It's a well-known sports writer, Alex Wolff. And he was a Milton J. Shapiro. So Milton J. Shapiro had his impact on cultivating interest in sports in young people. The other guy, you tell me, is this a likely Jewish name? His name is Gene Schoor, Schoor.
Yes.
We think so, okay?
Yeah.
But here's the killer. This morning, under the influence of your book, I looked them both up, and, on the web, and under Gene Schoor is like sports writer, blah, blah, blah. And the three books that I recognized having read of his as a kid, it was like Leo DeRocher, Joe DiMaggio, and Pee Wee Reese. In parentheses, it said, possibly ghostwritten by Milton J. Shapiro. So we don't know if there was actually one or we don't know. It's just strange.
Well, I have an essay to assign for the second edition then.
You do? I mean,
are you up for it?
I'm game. I'm if the price is right. I mean, we can talk later.
Okay.
But let me say, this is really it's a great book to just pick up and read at any moment, and you could do that many, many times because the pieces are very short, well written, and there's a whole lot of them. I guess you know the exact number, right?
50.
That's a lot. That's a lot. So Jewish Jocks, in the broadest sense of that term, and thanks for taking the time, Frank.
Thanks, Bob.
Okay, see you.